Memory and cognition cover far more than remembering facts. They include how we organize information, solve problems, make decisions, store experiences, and sometimes confidently remember things that never happened exactly as we recall them. In this video, we are working through 85 terms that every psychology student should know, beginning with the thinking processes your mind uses every day. Your brain makes decisions all day, but it does not carefully calculate every possible answer. It organizes experience into categories. It compares new situations with familiar ones. It reaches for shortcuts. Most of the time, that efficiency helps. Sometimes it creates predictable mistakes. Understanding cognition means learning both how thinking works and where it can go wrong. For each term, you will see a concise definition and a real-life example. Do not stop at memorizing the wording. Pause when you need to, explain the idea in your own words, and see whether you can recognize it in a different situation. That application step matters for both Intro to Psychology and the modern AP Psychology exam. We will begin with thinking, problem-solving, judgment, and decision-making. These terms explain how we organize knowledge, choose possible solutions, and sometimes get trapped by the very shortcuts that normally make thinking more efficient.
Welcome back to the Psychology Notebook. I'm Desiree, and this video is part of my Psychology Study Resource Series, where I cover hundreds of psychology terms to help you learn the science of psychology. Most terminology videos use my AI-assisted voice to keep the audio clear and easy to follow, especially for viewers studying psychology around the world. For more classroom-style lessons with my natural teaching voice, check out the full Psych 101 series and the lecture playlist for on-camera and behind-the-scenes content. Now, let's get into today's terms. Cognition. Cognition is the broad umbrella term for the mental processes involved in thinking, knowing, remembering, and deciding. It includes processes such as attention, perception, language, memory, judgment, and problem-solving. For example, when you plan the quickest route to class, you use memory to recall the area, attention to notice traffic, and judgment to choose between possible routes. Those processes are different, but they are all part of cognition. 2. Cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is the branch of psychology that studies mental processes, including how people attend, remember, reason, solve problems, and use language. A cognitive psychologist might compare whether people remember pictures more accurately than words after a delay. The focus is not only on the final answer or behavior, it is also on the mental processes that help produce that response. 3. Concept. A concept is a mental category used to group similar objects, ideas, events, or experiences. The concept of a bird includes robins, penguins, and ostriches, even though they do not look or behave exactly alike. Concepts make thinking more efficient because we do not have to treat every new object as completely unfamiliar. We can place it into a category and use what we already know about that group. 4. Prototype. A prototype is the most typical or ideal example of a concept. If someone asks you to picture a bird, you may imagine a robin before you imagine a penguin. The robin is closer to your prototype, but both animals still belong to the concept of bird. A prototype is the quick mental reference point. The concept is the larger category that includes many different members. 5. Schema. A schema is a mental framework that organizes knowledge and guides expectations. Your restaurant schema may include being seated, reading a menu, ordering food, eating, and paying. Because you already have that framework, you know roughly what to expect in a new restaurant. Schemas make situations easier to interpret, but they can also shape what we notice and cause us to overlook information that does not fit our expectations. 6. Assimilation. Assimilation happens when you fit new information into an existing schema without changing the schema itself. Imagine a young child who knows what a dog is and sees a wolf for the first time. The child may call it a dog because the new animal fits the framework already available. The new information is being interpreted through the old category. Think of assimilation as adding another example to an existing mental folder. 7. Accommodation. Accommodation happens when new information does not fit an existing schema, so the schema must be changed or a new one must be created. After learning that wolves and dogs are related but different animals, the child revises the original category. Now there are separate mental folders for dogs and wolves. Assimilation fits information into what you already know. Accommodation changes what you know so the new information can fit accurately. 8. Algorithm. An algorithm is a step-by-step problem-solving procedure that guarantees a correct solution when it is followed properly and a solution exists. Long division is a familiar example. You follow the same ordered steps rather than guessing. Algorithms are systematic and reliable, but they can take more time and effort than a mental shortcut. That difference becomes important when we compare algorithms with heuristics. 9. Heuristic A. Heuristic is a quick mental shortcut that simplifies judgment or problem solving. If you choose the busiest restaurant because you assume it is probably good, you are using a shortcut instead of comparing every menu, review, price, and ingredient. Heuristics save time and mental energy. They are often useful, but unlike algorithms, they do not guarantee the correct answer. The next two terms describe specific heuristics that can produce predictable errors. 10. Representativeness, heuristic. The representativeness. Heuristic means judging how likely something is based on how closely it matches a prototype or stereotype. If a quiet person who loves books seems like a librarian, someone may choose that occupation even when other jobs are statistically more common. The description feels representative, but resemblance alone does not establish probability. This shortcut can cause people to ignore base rates and other important evidence. 11. Availability, heuristic. The availability. Heuristic means judging how common or likely something is by how easily examples come to mind. After seeing repeated news coverage of a plane crash, someone may overestimate the danger of flying because the example is vivid and easy to recall. Memorable events feel more frequent than they really are. The key question is not whether an example comes to mind quickly. It is whether that example accurately represents the evidence.
12. Mental set. A mental set is the tendency to keep using a familiar solution because it worked before, even when a different approach would work better now. A student may continue rereading notes because that method helped on simple vocabulary quizzes, even after the course begins testing application. The old method feels reasonable because it has a history of success. Mental sets can make problem-solving rigid and keep people from noticing better options. 13. Priming. Priming occurs when exposure to one stimulus activates related ideas and influences what comes to mind next. Seeing the word yellow can make the word banana easier to recognize a moment later because the ideas are associated in memory. Priming does not mean someone is being mind-controlled. It means related concepts become temporarily more accessible, sometimes without the person consciously noticing the influence. 14. Framing. Framing refers to the way information is presented and how that presentation changes judgment. A medical treatment described as 90% successful often feels more appealing than one described as having a 10% failure rate. Mathematically, the information is equivalent. Psychologically, the positive and negative frames can produce different reactions. Framing reminds us that decisions depend not only on facts, but also on how those facts are worded. 15. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is the false belief that a random outcome becomes more likely because the opposite outcome has happened repeatedly. After 5 fair coin tosses land on heads, someone may believe tails is now due, but each toss is independent. The coin does not remember the earlier results, so the probability remains the same. A streak can feel meaningful, even when it does not change the next random event. 16. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy occurs when people continue a choice because they have already invested time, money, or effort, even when stopping would be better. You may finish a terrible movie because you already watched the first hour. That hour cannot be recovered either way. A more rational decision focuses on what happens next. The important question is whether the remaining time is worth spending, not whether the past investment feels wasted. 17. Executive functions. Executive functions are mental control processes that help people plan, organize, focus, manage impulses, and carry out goal-directed behavior. Completing a research paper requires you to break the task into steps, hold relevant information in mind, resist distractions, switch strategies when something fails, and monitor your progress. Executive functions do not represent one single skill. They coordinate several processes, so behavior stays aligned with a goal. 18. Critical thinking. Critical thinking is the careful evaluation of claims, evidence, assumptions, and alternative explanations. Before sharing a psychology claim online, a student might locate the original study, examine the sample, distinguish correlation from causation, and ask what else could explain the result. Critical thinking is not simply criticizing everything. It means using organized reasoning to decide how much confidence a claim deserves. 19. Creativity. Creativity is the ability to produce ideas or solutions that are both novel and useful. Being unusual by itself is not enough. A creative response also needs value within the situation. For example, a student may create a new visual analogy that makes a difficult memory model easier to understand. The idea is original, but it also serves a clear purpose. Creativity often involves generating possibilities before selecting the strongest one. 20. Divergent thinking. Divergent thinking means generating many different possible ideas or solutions. If you brainstorm 10 ways to teach the same psychology concept, you are expanding outward rather than searching immediately for one correct answer. Divergent thinking values variety, flexibility, and originality during the idea generation stage. Evaluation can come later. First, the goal is to create options that would not appear if you stopped at the first reasonable answer. 21. Convergent thinking. Convergent thinking means narrowing possibilities to identify the single best or correct solution. Choosing the strongest response from 4. AP psychology answer choices is a convergent task because the options must be evaluated against the evidence and course concepts. Divergent thinking expands the field of possibilities. Convergent thinking reduces that field. Strong problem solving often uses both, first creating options and then judging which one works best. 22. Functional fixedness. Functional fixedness is difficulty seeing an object as useful for anything beyond its usual purpose. Imagine needing to tighten a flathead screw without a screwdriver. A coin might work, but functional fixedness can prevent you from seeing it as a tool because you think of it only as money. The object has not changed. The limitation comes from the way its function is represented in your mind. That completes our first 22 terms. The larger pattern is that thinking depends on organization and efficiency. Concepts and schemas help us organize. Algorithms and heuristics help us solve. Executive functions help us stay directed toward a goal, but the same system can become rigid or biased through mental sets, framing, fallacies, and functional fixedness. Next, we move from thinking into the types and biological foundations of memory. Types and core processes of memory. Now that we have looked at how people think and make decisions, we can turn to memory. First, we need a map. Memory is not one single mental container. It includes processes that move information in and out, conscious memories for facts and events, less conscious memory expressed through skills, and even memory for actions we intend to complete later. 23. Memory is the persistence of learning over time through encoding, storage, and retrieval. It is not only a place where information sits, it is a set of processes. You first take in information, retain some version of it, and later access it when needed. Recognizing a classmate weeks after meeting them shows that earlier, learning persisted and became available again. 24. Encoding. Encoding is the process of getting information into memory. Your mind must register and transform incoming information into a form that can be processed and retained. For example, linking a new psychology term to a familiar picture gives the information meaning and creates more than one way to represent it. If information is never encoded effectively, there may be little available to retrieve later. 25. Storage is the retention of encoded information over time. Once information has been encoded, some of it must remain available beyond the immediate moment. A formula learned today is stored if it can still be used on next week's exam. Storage does not mean every detail remains unchanged or equally accessible. It means information has been maintained within the memory system. 26. Retrieval is the process of accessing information that has been stored in memory. When a login screen appears and you remember your password, stored information becomes available for use. Retrieval can happen through recall, recognition, or the help of cues, which we will cover later. A memory can exist in storage and still be difficult to retrieve at a particular moment. 27. Explicit memory, declarative memory. Explicit memory, also called declarative memory, is conscious memory for facts and events that can be described or reported. If you explain what classical conditioning means or describe what happened at yesterday's class, you are deliberately bringing information to mind. Explicit memory includes two major categories. Episodic memory holds personally experienced events, while semantic memory holds facts, concepts, and meanings. 28. Episodic memory. Episodic memory is explicit memory for personally experienced events and their context. Remembering your first day at a new school may include the building, the people you met, and how you felt. The memory is tied to an episode in your own life. It is different from simply knowing a fact about schools. Episodic memory answers questions such as what happened, where it happened, and when it occurred.
29. Semantic memory. Semantic memory is explicit memory for facts, concepts, meanings, and general knowledge. Knowing that the hippocampus is involved in memory uses semantic memory. You may know the fact without remembering the exact class, page, or day when you learned it. Episodic memory is tied to a personal event. Semantic memory is the knowledge itself, separated from a specific learning episode. 30. Implicit memory, non-declarative memory. Implicit memory, also called non-declarative memory, is memory expressed through performance without deliberate conscious recall. A person may type a familiar password quickly without consciously naming the location of every key. Past experience is influencing behavior, even though the person is not describing a remembered event or fact. Explicit memory is often reported in words. Implicit memory is often demonstrated through what someone does. 31. Procedural memory. Procedural memory is implicit memory for how to perform learned skills and procedures. Riding a bicycle, tying your shoes, or playing a familiar piano pattern can depend on procedural memory. You may perform the action smoothly while struggling to explain every movement involved. Procedural memory is knowing how through practiced performance. It is not the same as consciously recalling facts about the skill. 32. Prospective memory. Prospective memory is memory for an intention or action that must be completed in the future. Remembering to take medication at 8 in the evening is a prospective memory task. The information may be simple. The challenge is remembering to act at the right time or when the right cue appears. Prospective memory looks forward. Episodic memory usually looks back at an event that already occurred. 33. Long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is a lasting increase in synaptic strength after repeated activation. When connected neurons are activated frequently, communication across particular synapses can become more efficient. This process is one biological mechanism that supports learning and memory. Long-term potentiation is not a type of memory like episodic or procedural memory.
It helps explain how experience can produce more durable changes in neural communication. Section 2 closing. That gives us the basic map. Memory depends on encoding, storage, and retrieval. Explicit memory includes episodic and semantic information that can be consciously reported. Implicit memory is expressed more through performance, with procedural memory as a major example. Prospective memory helps us remember future intentions, and long-term potentiation gives us a biological process that can strengthen neural communication. Next, we will compare the major models and systems psychologists use to explain how memory operates.
Hi, Desiree here. Quick pause and a friendly reminder that everything for this lesson is linked below. Notes, slides, and extra help just in case this starts to feel a little overwhelming. And if you're getting value from this, a like, subscribe, or even sharing this with your favorite psych enthusiast really helps us keep making psychology education more accessible and actually fun. And if I inspired you, whether you're a teacher or you just want to start creating your own videos using AI, those tools are also listed below. Now, let's get back into the episode.
Memory models and systems. We now have the basic categories of memory. The next question is how the system works. Psychologists use several models because no single diagram explains every part of memory. The working memory model focuses on what the mind actively holds and uses. The multi-store model follows information through sensory, short-term, and long-term memory. The levels of processing model asks how deeply information is encoded. 34. Working memory model. The working memory model explains how a limited active memory system coordinates different kinds of information while interacting with long-term memory. Imagine solving a word problem. You may hold the wording in mind, picture the quantities, and decide what to do next. The current AP psychology framework emphasizes three interacting components: the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visuospatial sketchpad. Some modern versions also include an episodic buffer, but it is not one of the three components named in the current AP framework. 35. Working memory. Working memory is the limited capacity mental workspace used to hold and actively use information during an ongoing task. If you add 27 and 18 in your head, you must keep partial results available while completing the calculation. Working memory is related to short-term memory, but the terms are not perfectly interchangeable. Short-term memory mainly emphasizes temporary storage. Working memory emphasizes active attention, updating, and manipulation. 36. Central executive. The central executive is the control component of working memory. It directs attention, selects priorities, shifts focus, and coordinates the other subsystems. When you follow spoken directions while checking a map, the central executive helps allocate attention between the verbal steps and the visual spatial information. Think of it as a manager of mental activity, not as a storage bin containing one particular kind of content. 37. Phonological loop. The phonological loop is the working memory component that briefly holds and rehearses verbal and auditory information. Repeating a phone number to yourself until you enter it keeps the sound pattern active for a short time. The word phonological points to speech and sound. The loop does not create permanent storage by itself. It keeps verbal material available while you are using it. 38. Visuospatial sketchpad. The visuospatial sketchpad is the working memory component that briefly holds and manipulates visual and spatial information. Mentally rotating a puzzle piece to see whether it will fit is a visuospatial task. Visual information concerns appearance. Spatial information concerns location, arrangement, and movement. This system lets you work with an image in your mind even when the object is not directly in front of you. 39. Multi-store model, Atkinson-Shiffrin model. The multi-store model, also called the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, proposes three interacting memory stores. Information first enters sensory memory. Some attended information moves into short-term memory, and some of that information becomes available in long-term memory. A lecture sound may be briefly registered, actively attended to, and later remembered. The model gives students a useful stage-by-stage map, although contemporary memory research is more complex than a single straight line. 40. Sensory memory. Sensory memory is the very brief initial storage of incoming sensory information. It holds a momentary record of sights, sounds, and other input before most of it fades or receives attention. A sparkler can appear to leave a short trail because the visual information remains briefly available. Sensory memory is not a detailed long-term record. It is the first fleeting stage in the multi-store model. 41. Iconic memory. Iconic memory is the very brief visual form of sensory memory. A bright image may seem to remain for a fraction of a second after the screen goes dark. That fading visual trace is iconic memory. The word iconic can help you remember image. This does not mean people store a perfect internal photograph. Iconic memory is fleeting and disappears quickly unless attention selects the information. 42. Echoic memory. Echoic memory is the brief auditory form of sensory memory. Sometimes you ask someone what they said, but before they repeat it, the words seem to return. A fading sound trace was still briefly available. Echoic connects naturally to echo. It generally lasts longer than iconic memory, but it is still a short sensory record rather than long-term storage. 43. Short-term memory. Short-term memory is a limited capacity system that briefly holds information in an active state. Keeping a verification code in mind long enough to type it is a short-term memory task. Without rehearsal or additional processing, the information can fade within seconds. Short-term memory and working memory are closely related, but the emphasis differs. Short-term memory focuses on temporary holding. Working memory includes the active manipulation of what is being held. 44. Long-term memory. Long-term memory is relatively durable storage for information retained beyond the immediate moment. It can preserve knowledge, experiences, and skills across days, years, or even decades. Remembering a childhood address years later draws on long-term memory. Its capacity is considered vast, but long-term does not mean permanent, perfectly accurate, or always easy to retrieve. Storage and access are separate questions. 45. Automatic processing. Automatic processing is encoding that occurs with little conscious effort or deliberate attention. An experienced reader recognizes familiar words without consciously decoding every letter. Information about space, time, frequency, and well-practiced skills may also be processed relatively automatically. Automatic does not mean the process is flawless or completely free of attention. It means the task requires much less deliberate effort than it once did. 46. Effortful processing. Effortful processing is encoding that requires conscious attention and deliberate effort. Learning unfamiliar brain structures usually demands focus, practice, and organized study. A task that is effortful now may become more automatic after enough experience. That is why expert performance can look easy even when the same task requires intense concentration from a beginner. 47. Levels of processing. Model. The levels of processing model proposes that memory depends on how deeply information is encoded. Structural processing focuses on appearance, such as whether a word is printed in capital letters. Phonemic processing focuses on sound, such as whether the word rhymes with another word. Semantic processing focuses on meaning and is the deepest of the three levels in the current AP framework. Thinking about what a term means usually produces stronger memory than noticing only its font or sound.
The working memory model explains how the mind actively coordinates verbal and visual spatial information. The multi-store model follows information through sensory, short-term, and long-term stores. The levels of processing model explains why meaning usually produces stronger encoding than surface details. These models overlap, but they are not interchangeable. Next, we will turn from the models to the specific strategies that help people encode and store information more effectively.
Encoding and storing memories. Now that we have the major memory systems, we can ask a practical question. What helps information stay? Encoding strategies organize new material, connect it to meaning, and spread learning across time. Storage processes then help stabilize what was learned. In this section, we will separate strategies that sound similar, including spacing and distributed practice, primacy and recency, and maintenance and elaborative rehearsal. 48. Mnemonic device. A mnemonic device is a deliberate memory aid that organizes information into a form that is easier to encode and retrieve. A phrase such as, "My very educated mother just served us nachos," uses the first letters to cue the order of the planets. Mnemonics can use acronyms, rhymes, imagery, songs, or meaningful associations. They support memory, but they do not replace understanding. Also, the first M in mnemonic is silent. 49. Method of loci. The method of loci is a mnemonic that links information to familiar imagined locations along a mental route. To remember the points in a speech, you might picture each point in a different room of your home. Later, you mentally walk through the rooms to retrieve them. Loci means places. The locations are not the information itself. They provide an organized set of retrieval cues. 50. Chunking. Chunking means grouping separate pieces of information into larger, meaningful units. The number 4, 1, 2, 5, 5, 5, 0, 1, 9, 8 is easier to manage when it becomes 3 familiar groups: 4, 1, 2, 5, 5, 5, and 0, 1, 9, 8. Chunking reduces the number of separate units working memory must handle. It works best when the groups already mean something to the learner. 51. Spacing effect. The spacing effect is the finding that learning spread across time usually produces stronger long-term retention than learning completed all at once. 4 shorter review sessions across a week generally work better than 1 long night of cramming. The spacing effect is the result, or memory advantage. Distributed practice is the schedule used to produce that advantage. The best spacing interval can vary with the material and how long you need to remember it. 52. Massed practice. Massed practice places a large amount of studying or practice into one concentrated session. Trying to learn an entire unit the night before an exam is the familiar example of cramming. It can create strong, immediate familiarity, which may feel like mastery. But that feeling does not guarantee durable memory. Compared with distributed practice, massed practice generally produces weaker long-term retention. 53. Distributed practice. Distributed practice means spreading learning across multiple sessions separated by time. Reviewing the same material on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday is distributed practice. The breaks allow some forgetting, so returning to the material requires the memory to be rebuilt and strengthened. Distributed practice describes the schedule. The improved long-term retention associated with that schedule is the spacing effect. 54. Serial position effect. The serial position effect is the tendency to remember items at the beginning and end of a list better than items in the middle. If you hear 15 words, the first few and the last few are often easier to recall. The beginning advantage is called the primacy effect. The ending advantage is called the recency effect. Serial position effect is the larger pattern that includes both. 55. Primacy effect. The primacy effect is better memory for items presented near the beginning of a sequence. Early items often receive more attention and rehearsal before later information arrives, giving them a better chance of reaching long-term memory. If the beginning of a vocabulary list is easiest to recall, that is a primacy effect. Primacy means first. It is 1/2 of the serial position effect. 56. Recency effect. The recency effect is better memory for items presented near the end of a sequence. Immediately after a list ends, the last few items may still be active in short-term memory. That gives them an advantage during immediate recall. A delay or distracting task can reduce this effect because the final items are no longer as active. Recency means recent, and it is the other half of the serial position effect. 57. Maintenance rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal means repeating information to keep it active for a short period. You might repeat a room number until you reach the correct hallway. The repetition refreshes the information, but it does not necessarily connect it to meaning or prior knowledge. Maintenance rehearsal can prolong temporary storage. It is usually less effective for durable learning than elaborative rehearsal.
58. Elaborative rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal connects new information to meaning, examples, or knowledge already stored in memory. To learn negative reinforcement, you might connect the definition to a seatbelt alarm stopping after you buckle up. The term is no longer an isolated sentence. It now has a concept, an example, and a relationship. Elaboration generally supports stronger long-term retention than repetition alone. 59. Highly superior autobiographical memory. Highly superior autobiographical memory, often shortened to HSAM, is a rare ability to recall an unusually large number of personal dates and life events in detail. A person may hear a past date and describe what happened in their own life that day. This is not perfect memory for everything. Someone with HSAM may not have exceptional memory for arbitrary word lists, textbook facts, or every detail of every event. 60. Autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory is memory for events and information connected to your own life. Remembering your first day at a new school is autobiographical memory. So is knowing the name of that school, even if you are not reliving one specific moment. Autobiographical memory therefore includes personal experiences and personal facts. It helps build a continuing sense of life history and identity. 61. Self-reference effect. The self-reference effect is better memory for information encoded in relation to oneself. A student may remember a personality trait more easily after deciding whether it describes them. The self provides a rich network of existing knowledge and associations, giving the new material more possible retrieval paths. Self-reference works best when the personal connection is meaningful, not when the learner simply inserts the word me without thinking. 62. Memory consolidation. Memory consolidation is the process by which a newly formed, fragile memory becomes more stable over time. After learning, biological and cognitive changes help strengthen and reorganize the memory. Sleep can support consolidation, but consolidation is not simply another word for sleep, and researchers distinguish several timescales and mechanisms. The useful beginner idea is that storing a memory is not an instant save. New memories need time to stabilize.
Mnemonic devices, loci, and chunking organize information. Spacing and distributed practice use time more effectively than cramming. Serial position explains why beginnings and endings stand out. Maintenance rehearsal keeps information active, while elaborative rehearsal connects it to meaning. Autobiographical memory and the self-reference effect show why personal relevance can strengthen encoding. Finally, consolidation reminds us that a new memory needs time to stabilize. Next, we will focus on how stored information is brought back through retrieval. Retrieving memories. Encoding and storage matter, but a memory is only useful when you can get it back. Retrieval is not one single process. Sometimes you must produce an answer with very little help. Sometimes the answer becomes familiar when you see it. Cues, surroundings, mood, physical state, and deliberate practice can all influence what becomes accessible. In this section, we will separate 9 terms that explain how memories return. 63.
Recall. Recall means bringing stored information to mind without being shown the answer. An essay question uses recall because you must produce what you know instead of selecting from choices. Free response questions, short answer questions, and remembering a name on your own all rely on recall. A question still provides a topic, but it does not present the target answer. That usually makes recall more demanding than recognition. 64. Recognition. Recognition means identifying previously learned information when you encounter it again. A multiple choice question uses recognition because the possible answers are already present. You may recognize a face in a crowd even if you could not recall the person's name a moment earlier. Recognition often requires less retrieval effort than recall, but familiarity alone is not proof that the choice is correct. 65. Retrieval cue. A retrieval cue is an internal or external signal that helps activate a stored memory. The smell of sunscreen might suddenly bring back a childhood beach trip. A cue can be a word, place, sound, emotion, smell, image, or related idea. The cue is not the memory itself. It provides a pathway toward information that was stored. Strong cues often overlap with features that were present during encoding. 66. Context-dependent memory. Context-dependent memory is improved retrieval when the external environment matches the setting where learning occurred. Returning to the room where you studied may help certain details come back because features of that room became part of the memory's cue pattern. Context can include sights, sounds, smells, and spatial surroundings. Matching context can help, but it does not guarantee recall, and students do not need to recreate an entire classroom to remember well. 67. Mood-congruent memory. Mood-congruent memory is the tendency for memories that match your current mood to become easier to retrieve. When someone feels discouraged, other disappointing experiences may come to mind more readily. When someone feels cheerful, positive memories may become more accessible. The mood does not create those memories. It changes which stored experiences are easiest to reach. The current AP framework discusses mood as a retrieval condition, while many psychology texts use mood congruence specifically for this match between present mood and remembered content. 68. State-dependent memory. State-dependent memory is improved retrieval when a person's internal physical state matches the state present during learning. Material learned while caffeinated, for example, may sometimes be easier to retrieve in a similar caffeinated state. The relevant cue is a physiological condition rather than the external room. This is a description of how retrieval can work, not a recommendation to rely on caffeine, medication changes, or any substance as a study method.
69. Retrieval practice. Retrieval practice means strengthening learning by actively trying to bring information out of memory. A student can close the notes, answer a question from memory, check the answer, and try again later. The important step is the attempt to retrieve, not simply looking at the answer. Feedback helps correct errors. Retrieval practice is the learning activity. The testing effect is the improved later retention that this activity can produce. 70. Testing effect. The testing effect is better long-term retention after retrieving information through testing than after restudying alone. Self-quizzing today can produce stronger recall next week than spending the same amount of time rereading. A useful practice test does more than measure learning. It becomes a learning event. The benefit is strongest when the learner genuinely retrieves the answer and then receives feedback. The testing effect is the outcome. Retrieval practice is the method. 71. Metacognition. Metacognition is awareness and regulation of your own thinking and learning. A student uses metacognition when they self-test, notice weak recall for one topic, and change the study plan. It includes monitoring what you know, judging confidence, selecting strategies, and checking whether those strategies actually work. One common problem is mistaking familiarity for mastery. A page can look familiar even when you cannot retrieve the information without it. Retrieval depends on both the task and the cues available.
Recall asks you to produce an answer, while recognition asks you to identify one. Context, mood, and physical state can make certain memories easier to reach. Retrieval practice turns remembering into a study method, and the testing effect describes the later benefit. Metacognition helps you notice what you can actually retrieve instead of trusting familiarity. Next, we will examine forgetting, interference, distortion, amnesia, and other memory challenges. Forgetting, distortion, and memory. Challenges memory is powerful, but it is not a perfect recording. Information can fail to enter memory, weaken over time, compete with other learning, or become difficult to retrieve. Remembering is also constructive. Each time we rebuild an event, later information and imagination can influence what feels familiar. Finally, injury and disease can disrupt memory in different ways. In this last section, we will separate 14 terms that explain forgetting, distortion, amnesia, and other memory challenges. 72. Forgetting curve. The forgetting curve is a pattern showing rapid memory loss soon after learning, followed by a slower decline. Hermann Ebbinghaus demonstrated this general pattern using carefully controlled learning material. Imagine studying a vocabulary list once and then never revisiting it. A large portion may become inaccessible during the first few days, while later losses occur more gradually. This does not mean every person forgets the same amount on the same schedule, meaning prior knowledge, sleep, spacing, and retrieval practice can all change the curve. 73. Encoding failure. Encoding failure occurs when information was never successfully placed into memory. You may handle familiar coins for years, but still be unable to reproduce the exact design because those details were never important enough to encode carefully. The same thing happens when someone looks at a page while their attention is elsewhere. Later, it may feel as if the memory disappeared. In reality, a durable memory may never have formed. Retrieval cannot recover information that did not enter storage in the first place. 74. Proactive interference. Proactive interference happens when older information disrupts the learning or retrieval of newer information. After changing a password, the old password may keep appearing when you try to enter the new one. The earlier memory moves forward and competes with what came later. A simple memory cue is old blocks new. Proactive interference is especially likely when the two memories are similar, such as old and new phone numbers, locker combinations, or routes. 75. Retroactive interference. Retroactive interference happens when newer information disrupts retrieval of older information. After memorizing a new phone number, you may struggle to remember the old one. The recent learning reaches backward and competes with what came before. The memory cue is new blocks old. Proactive and retroactive interference are easy to reverse, so focus on the direction. Proactive starts with the past, while retroactive starts with the recent information. 76. Tip of the tongue phenomenon. The tip of the tongue phenomenon is a temporary inability to retrieve familiar information, even though you feel close to the answer. You may know that you know an actor's name, remember its first sound, or think of similar names, but still cannot produce the exact one. This is not usually evidence that the memory is gone. It reflects partial access without successful retrieval of the target. A useful cue or a little time may eventually bring the answer into awareness. 77. Repression. Repression is a psychodynamic concept associated with Sigmund Freud. It proposes that the mind can unconsciously keep distressing thoughts, feelings, or memories outside conscious awareness. Repression is not the same as suppression, which is a deliberate choice to avoid thinking about something. This term requires caution. People can forget traumatic experiences, remember them later, or develop memories influenced by suggestion. But psychologists do not treat every inaccessible memory as proof of a hidden, repressed event. In this video, learn repression as a historical theoretical explanation, not as a settled neurological mechanism. 78. Misinformation effect. The misinformation effect is a memory distortion caused by misleading information presented after an event. In classic eyewitness research, the wording of a later question influenced how people remembered a collision. A suggestion about broken glass, for example, can make glass feel familiar even when none was present. The person is not necessarily lying. The misleading detail can become integrated into the reconstructed memory. This is one reason investigators try to avoid leading questions and repeated suggestion. 79. Source amnesia. Source amnesia means remembering information while forgetting or misidentifying where it came from. You may remember a surprising fact, but be unable to tell whether you heard it from a professor, watched it in a video, or saw it in a social post. The content remains familiar while its origin becomes detached or confused. Source amnesia helps explain why repeated claims can begin to feel trustworthy. Familiarity answers, "Have I encountered this?" but it does not reliably answer, "Where did it come from?" 80. Constructive memory. Constructive memory means that remembering is a process of rebuilding, not replaying an exact recording. The mind combines stored details with schemas, expectations, later information, and the questions being asked now. That is why two people can remember the same conversation differently without either person intentionally lying. Constructive does not mean every memory is false. It means recollection is assembled from available information, which makes memory flexible and useful, but also leaves room for omissions and distortions. 81. Imagination inflation. Imagination inflation is increased confidence that an event occurred after repeatedly imagining it. When a plausible childhood incident is pictured in detail, the imagined scene can become more familiar. Later, that familiarity may be interpreted as evidence that the event really happened. Imagination alone does not prove a memory is false, and confidence alone does not prove it is accurate. The key idea is that repeated mental simulation can change belief in an event without independently verifying the event. 82. Anterograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is difficulty forming new long-term memories after an injury or the onset of illness. A person may remember much of life before surgery, but repeatedly forget people met afterward. The problem is not simply losing every memory. Different memory systems can be affected differently. The well-known patient Henry Molaison had severe difficulty forming new declarative memories while still showing some ability to learn new procedures. For the basic distinction, anterograde points forward. New memory formation after onset is impaired. 83. Retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is loss of memories formed before an injury or the onset of illness. After an accident, someone might form new memories but remain unable to recall events from the preceding weeks. The loss is not always uniform. Recent memories may be more vulnerable than remote memories, and procedural abilities can remain intact. Retrograde points backward toward previously stored information. Compare it with anterograde amnesia, which primarily disrupts the formation of new, long-term memories after onset. 84. Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive brain disease that damages memory, thinking, and daily functioning. It is the most common cause of dementia. Early symptoms often include difficulty learning or remembering new information, but the disease eventually affects language, reasoning, orientation, behavior, and the ability to complete everyday tasks. Alzheimer's is not the same as occasionally forgetting a name or misplacing an object. It involves worsening impairment caused by disease-related changes in the brain. Diagnosis and treatment belong with qualified health professionals, not a vocabulary checklist. 85. Infantile amnesia. Infantile amnesia is the typical inability of adults to recall autobiographical events from the first years of life, especially before about age 3. An adult may know family stories or recognize photographs from toddlerhood without having a first-person episodic memory of the event.
Early experiences still matter and can influence later development. The gap reflects limits in autobiographical memory, not a complete absence of learning. Brain development, language, a stable sense of self, and the way families talk about the past may all contribute. Forgetting can begin when information never enters memory, fades over time, or competes with other learning. Retrieval can feel close without becoming complete, as in the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Memories can also change when later information, confused sources, schemas, or imagination become part of reconstruction. Amnesia and Alzheimer's disease show that memory is not one single ability located in one simple place. That completes all 85 memory and cognition terms. Use this glossary as a reference, then test yourself by explaining the differences without looking at the definitions.
Thank you for learning with me, and according to YouTube, this video is perfect for you on your learning journey. Click it and I'll see you over there.